we immediately see the extra VRAM compared to 8GB cards pay off with the B570 in Horizon Forbidden West at 1080p very high settings, where the B570 is comfortably giving us 65 FPS average, whereas the 6600 is only hitting 43, but not only that, it's getting additional spikes on its frame time graph, stutters as it goes over its VRAM capacity, leading to a 77% advantage for the B570 in the 1% lows. It's important to note, though, that if we drop down to the medium settings, that the differential between the two cards is, well, very different, because we're now within the 8GB VRAM buffer. When this happens, the B570 is now hitting 87 FPS. But the 6600 is now closing the gap a bit at 73. The B570 still has a very noticeable lead by 19% and 14% in the 1% lows, but you see that less of a dramatic advantage, and that's because we're now within that 8GB VRAM buffer. But that is one of the advantages of the B570 with that 10 gigabytes. Now, let's pause here for a second, though, and talk about why am I even comparing the RX 6600 with the B570. First of all, I've already done an Nvidia comparison against the RTX 3050. When doing my AMD comparison for the B570, it was actually a little harder for me to choose which graphics card to compare against, because the B570 is meant to cost $220. That's the MSRP. The B580 has so far been kind of above its MSRP, maybe supply things. We'll have to see what happens. But it's meant to cost $220. I have the ASRock Challenger version over here I got as a review sample. Now, with AMD, though, here's the issue. If I'm going current gen, we have the RX 7600, but that's $250, meaning it's a direct, exact price competitor to the B580, at least if we compare on MSRP for the B580. Hopefully it gets back there. So I don't think it makes sense to compare the B570 directly against that exactly. So if I go down a bit, we can go to the 6600. And this is available as low as $190. It's generally priced around $200, and there's a few models available in that price range at $190, $200, $200, $210. And then there's the 6600 XT version, which is currently going for around $240. But by that point, you're basically at the $250 mark. Again, B580 competition, and so I don't think that necessarily, again, makes sense again. There was also the 6650 XT, which for a while you could get around the $220 to $240 range, but currently those lower price models don't seem to be available any longer. So that's why I've gone with the 6600 here. But it is important to note that there is that price difference, which means the B570, if we're talking percentage differentials, we should also talk about the price differential. Where if we do 220 divided by 190, we can see that the B570 costs an extra 16%. So if you see a result like this, where it's 19% faster, that means that it is offering better value, but only by a little bit. Although when we see results like we saw at the very high settings, where it's 51% faster, that's so much faster than the amount extra that you're paying that it's definitely offering better value than the 6600. So that's just stuff to keep in mind when we're looking at these results. I'll have some summary graphs at the end of the video, but for now, let me pop into the corner and go through all of the specific benchmark results. I've tested 1080p and 1440p, so perhaps let's jump into some 1440p results. At 1440p very high settings, no surprise that we're once again seeing VRAM issues on the 8GB card, leading to a 79% advantage for the B570. That being said, the B570 is only averaging 50 FPS here. The 6600 is totally unusable at 28. You might use the B570 at these settings, but again, since we are under 60 FPS now, I find this to be a less realistic test case than the 1080p very high settings, where I thought those were very much the way you might play the game on the B570. At 1440p, dropping down to medium settings might even be something that you'd want to do on the B570, which brings it to a 32% lead over the RX 6600. Still more than making up for its price premium, so it is offering better value here overall. Also on the VRAM issue, sometimes you don't have to go with, just default presets. So if you could have enabled perhaps the very high texture settings on the B570 with otherwise reduced settings to get a bit of better performance, that's another thing you can do with that additional VRAM, but for today's video, we're sticking mostly to graphics presets. Jumping into a less demanding game like Baldur's Gate 3, Both GPUs can do just fine at the ultra settings at 1080p. And here the B570 is only giving us a 3% advantage at 76 versus 74. So it's a win, and the 1% lows are a win by 8%. But here's an example of it not making up for its price difference, right? It costs 16% more, isn't 16% faster. At 1440p ultra settings, it does increase its advantage to 8% in the averages and actually to 23% in the 1% lows. And it has a bit of a smoother frame time graph. You can see on the AMD side of the frame time graph, there's these intermittent spikes, and I'm not seeing that so much on the B570. So that's a bit interesting. Let's go ahead and move to Final Fantasy XVI. Even at the low settings, neither GPU can deliver 60 FPS at 1080p. But the B570 gets a lot closer at 50 frames per second, which gives it a 25% advantage over the RX 6600, which is hitting 40 FPS. If we go up to 1440p resolution, you not only need to be at low settings, but even enabling some upscaling to get to near 60 FPS on the B570, but you're still not there. You're only hitting 50 here. But the 6600 is only hitting 43, so that gives us 16% advantage for the B570. Quick note on upscaling results. Pause here for a second. Notice I'm saying FSR and XeSS 66%. What the heck do I mean by that? Well, FSR and DLSS both call FSR and DLSS quality the same internal rendering resolution. XeSS used to follow that naming scheme until its 1.3 version, where it changed the naming scheme, where quality now refers to an even lower rendering resolution, and the ultra quality XeSS setting is matching the internal resolution that FSR and DLSS call the quality setting. So you could think of this as FSR quality, DLSS quality. XeSS gets a different name, which is why I'm not calling them quality. I'm calling it 66%, because that's the per axis resolution scaling that they're using here. It's downscaling it to 66% per axis. Anyway, long story short, I've matched the internal rendering resolution. However, that being said, I should also mention, I think the XeSS upscaler looks better than the FSR upscaler. So that is a visual advantage, even though they have the same internal rendering resolution. That's nice. And I actually have seen XeSS available in a ton of the games that I've been testing. Call of Duty Black Ops 6, I've tested at the basic preset because I'm assuming you're going to be playing a competitive online game trying to chase high frame rates rather than cranking up the visual settings. At these settings, the RX 6600 actually gets a win by 12% at 124 FPS versus 111. Do keep in mind, though, that AMD cards tend to perform really well in this game. Call of Duty Black Ops 6 again, and Call of Duty games in general seem to perform really well on AMD GPUs. This is a little bit less representative of what we'll see in other games. Also, if we move up to 1440p resolution, the B570 closes the gap, showing that, again, at the higher resolutions, it tends to increase its performance relative to the 6600. Now they're basically tied at 82 and 81, 1% lead for the 6600 in the averages, however, a 7% lead in the 1% lows for the B570. In general, I'd basically call this a tie. However, again, chasing high frame rates in a competitive game, I think a lot of people would actually want to go over 80 FPS here. So we're already down at the basic preset, so all that's left is kicking on more upscaling. And this does have XeSS and FSR. If we set them both to the same internal rendering resolution, we're now, again, pretty much matching performance. They're both hitting 101 FPS average, although the B570 does have a very small lead in the 1% lows at 84 versus 81. Let's go ahead and jump into Cyberpunk. So Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p ultra settings. This is a pretty good performance for the B570. We're seeing it hit 83 FPS here versus 60 FPS on the RX 6600. That's a 38% advantage for the B570. Again, way more than making up for the 16% price increase, and a 29% lead in the 1% lows. However, what about ray tracing? Now, GPUs of this caliber are just not going to be ray tracing monsters, and I don't think it should be a major part of your purchasing decision. That being said, it does look like the B570 crushes the RX 6600's ray tracing in this game. Notice I've only turned on RT reflections, though. I felt like the RT Ultra setting, RT Overdrive settings, that was too much. Even the RT Medium setting was too much. But if I was able to enable RT reflections and still be pretty playable on the B570 at a 51 FPS average. I'd still probably personally keep it off and go with the much higher frame rate that we had without it, since we're below 60 FPS here. The 6600 only hitting 31 FPS though, so it's a 65% lead for the B570 and a 74% advantage in the 1% lows. I did try out upscaling, which I don't like doing at 1080p. I just don't think there's a lot of pixels to work with, but look at the bottles in the back right now. It's really shimmering on the RX 6600, way more stable on the B570. Again, showing off that the XeSS machine learning-based upscaler does have image quality advantages over FSR. So I would say that here, the B570 is not only performing 61% better than the RX 6600, but its upscaler is producing a nicer looking image. And we're now hitting 74 FPS on the B570, so frame rate wise, this is definitely playable. That being said, I'm still not sure if trading the image quality for the better reflections is the trade-off I would make personally in this case. I might still just play at native 1080p Ultra on the B570 without upscaling to get the RT reflections going. Anyway, at 1440p resolution, I'm not going to try to push upscaling since already at the Ultra settings without upscaling, neither GPU is breaking 60 FPS. The B570 though is very playable at 54 FPS, whereas the RX 6600 is only hitting 34. That gives a 59% advantage to the B570. So it's really looking like Cyberpunk is a good showing for the ARC GPU here. Let's go ahead and kick on upscaling. So since neither GPU was hitting 60 FPS, I tried kicking on the upscaling, again at the 66% setting, and here we see the 41% advantage for the B570. Again, if you look at things like the bottles in the back behind the bar here, you'll see way more shimmering and lack of stability on the FSR upscale compared to the XeSS, so good image quality advantage there. And again, 41% faster as well, 65 versus 46. Let's go ahead and move into Ghost of Tsushima. At 1080p maximum settings, which is called very high in this game, both GPUs do well. At 60 FPS on the 6600, but 66 FPS on the B570. That's a 10% advantage. However, note that again, it's 16% more money, so this is a case where the 6600 is showing better value, at least in this particular game. That's at 1080p. At 1440p though, the B570 increases its advantage to 38% at 51 versus 37. So if you're gaming on a 1440p screen, the B570 is again showing that it expands its lead at the higher resolutions. Also nice to have the additional VRAM here. And the ARC B570 is showing allocation above 8 GB, so it is possible that that's helping out here at these settings. If we use upscaling on the very high preset, we're now seeing the B570 go to 65 FPS and 51 FPS on the RX 6600, giving a 27% advantage to the B570. And I would say XeSS, I still think looks a little better here, especially like a fizzle behind moving objects like the bird. However, I do think that this game looks pretty good with FSR. I think this is one of the better games for FSR image quality wise, but I do still think the XeSS image does still have the advantage. Now, God of War Ragnarok at 1080p medium settings. I had to go down to medium settings to get the GPUs near 60 FPS in my test scene here. The B570 is hitting 57 FPS and the 6600 is hitting 59, which does mean the 6600 has a win here. Those have been pretty few and far between, although again, it does cost less. It's winning by 4% though, so it's basically a tie, although the 1% lows are a 9% advantage. Both GPUs basically hanging out around 60 FPS here though. Pretty similar experience if you didn't run a frame rate counter. At 1440p medium settings, the B570 takes a 28% lead. So again, showing a pretty significant advantage at 1440p in a game where it didn't have one at 1080p. Kind of interesting. 46 versus 36, so the thing is 46 FPS is still maybe not how you'd want to play the game. So if we kick on upscaling on the medium preset, the B570 is now hitting 57 FPS average, so again, pretty playable here, right around 60 FPS. The 6600 goes up to 48, but that means the B570 is winning by 19%. And again, if you look at the upscalers, things in motion like this grass, and as objects are disoccluded, meaning uncovered by the player character, I think FSR is a little more fizzling. XeSS has less. So I think image quality and performance win here for the B570. Let's take a look at a Unreal Engine 5 graphical showcase like Hellblade 2, Senua's Saga. We have to go down to medium settings to get decent performance here, which would be at 46 FPS. Interestingly, both GPUs are exactly tied. 46 average, 42 in the 1% lows. Now, in this game, because it's so slow-paced and you do a lot of just walking around looking at things and solving puzzles, I actually think 46 FPS might be perfectly playable. I don't really think you need 60 FPS in this game, especially if you end up playing on a controller on a variable refresh rate display. That being said, if you do want to be closer to 60 FPS, you would have to go down to low settings and or use upscaling, which I try to avoid at 1080p if possible. So at 1080p low, the B570 is hitting 54, the 6600 is hitting 56, so that does give it the 6600 a 4% advantage. Again, I would say that if you're not running a frame rate counter, these would be delivering a virtually identical experience. You're not really going to be able to tell which GPU you were using. If we jump up to 1440p low settings, B570 is hitting 41 FPS, 6637. So now the B570 has an advantage, again at 1440p, that it didn't have at 1080p. It's now winning by 11% in the averages and 16% in the 1% lows. 41 FPS in this game, again, maybe playable given how slow-paced this game is. I'd probably want to chase a bit higher settings. We're already at the low preset though, so what are you going to do? Use upscaling. Unreal Engine 5 tends to respond extremely well to upscaling from a performance standpoint. And the B570 jumps all the way to 68 FPS. The 6600 jumps up to 60 though. So they're both giving you a 60 FPS experience, but the B570 is faster by 13%, almost making up for its 16% price increase. But XeSS, once again, I do think is delivering better image quality. So despite performance being somewhat similar, I do think the results look better on the Arc GPU. Here we're looking at Silent Hill 2. Since this game had ray tracing, I did test it. And when I test ray tracing, I usually do it as a setting above the maximum. So if you're already at epic settings and then kick on hardware accelerated ray tracing, neither GPU can break 30 FPS. So while this is a 44% advantage for the B570, I would classify both of these as unusable settings. If you try to use upscaling to increase performance, which again, I don't love doing at 1080p, but here we go. We do see the B570 winning by 54% now and hitting 37 FPS. The game's pretty slow paced. Maybe some people would choose to do this. I probably wouldn't personally. However, look at his hair. I think in FSR, the hair looks very pixelated. In XeSS, it still looks somewhat pixelated, but much less so. Similar things if you look at the foliage and motion and things like that. So I do think this is another example of XeSS having better image quality than FSR. Now, at 1080p low settings, that's actually how far down you have to go if you want to be around 60 FPS. Even the medium settings are below 60 FPS on the B570. So at low settings 1080p, native resolution, the B570 is winning by 22% at 67 versus 55, and 27% advantage in the 1% lows at 42 versus 33. Both have some spikes in the frame time graph, but this is just one of those Unreal Engine 5 games that's kind of like that. Sometimes Unreal Engine 5 just doesn't have the most smooth frame times. If we move up to 1440p, even at the low settings, we're not going to break 60 FPS, but the B570 is very playable at 53 FPS, so on a variable refresh rate display in a slow-paced game like this, that might be totally fine. It's a 36% advantage over the 39 FPS that we're seeing on the RX 6600, and a 20% lead in the 1% lows. However, if you do want to get to 60 FPS, you might need to try out upscaling. That gets the B570 up to 58 FPS. Which is a 26% advantage over the 6600, which is only hitting 46. Once again, if you look at the hair and stuff like that, I think you can still an image quality advantage for XeSS, although it's less pronounced than it was at 1080p, where upscaling is a lot harder to do. And that is my benchmark results that I had time to get you. So how about we summarize all of it? Let's take a look at this chart. So this chart is just everything I tested, both 1080p and 1440p with the few ray tracing results thrown in there. And this is not frame rates. So these numbers you're seeing here is not frames per second. This is a percentage differential between the GPUs. So this is the B570 divided by the 6600, getting us its percentage advantage. In the games where the 6600 had the lead, the negative numbers here are representing advantage for the 6600. The positive numbers are representing advantage for the B570. So what you can see here is that this is the split. So all of these games here are advantage B570. We've got basically 2 ties and then 3 wins for the 6600, although they're much less significant wins compared to what we're getting on the B570. So is the B570 faster than the 6600? Yes. The exact difference varies wildly. And that's something that we see with the Intel Arc GPUs, is just their performance just is less consistent game to game. But it's overall faster than the 6600, and if I do the geo mean of these results, it comes out to 24% faster on average, although you can see that some results are dramatically faster, and a lot of that's due, especially in games where the VRAM capacity became an issue, although that didn't happen in a lot of games. Anyway, if you prefer to see this split game by game rather than in order from greatest to least win for the B570, it looks like this. So you can see it more like all the different games grouped, all test settings on the different games grouped together. So this is the same results, but organized differently. If you want to just look at 1080p results, this is what we would see. So if we just look at 1080p, the B570 is 22% faster. So a little bit less, but again, still it's overall a win for the B570. And if we look at the 1440p results, although I'm also including the upscaled results in the same chart, because I think that's a very valid way to play at 1440p, especially on cards of this performance level. I think it's very likely you would be using some upscaling. Here we see that the worst result for the B570 was a tie, and that most results were a win, and some of them significantly so. The geo mean here is 26% faster. So it is a bit better at 1440p relative to 1080p when compared with the 6600, and that's not surprising. Now, I didn't set out to test ray tracing. I just tested some games, and if the games had ray tracing, I enabled it. So the only 2 games I tested had ray tracing, and I tested it with upscaling and without, and only at 1080p, because 1440p ray tracing on these cards I just think is asking too much. It is clear, though, that the B570 was massively faster in these cases, by 56% on average, if we do the geo mean. So is the B570 better at ray tracing? Yes. Was the ray tracing performance good enough that I think that's a major selling point? No. But if you're going to be enabling any ray tracing, and some games don't allow you to turn it off these days, the extra VRAM plus the extra ray tracing performance is certainly something to maybe mention. Now, do keep in mind, once again, though, the price difference. You can get the 6600 for as low as $190. So let's do a little bit of a value calculation here at the end. So if the B570 is about 16% faster, sorry, not faster, 16% more expensive, but it's on average about 24% faster, we could do a calculation like this. 1.24, that's how much faster it is as expressed as a multiplication amount, right? It's 1.24 times faster, but it's also about 1.16 times more expensive. So this is your performance ratio divided by your price ratio, which means it's offering about 7% better value. However, that additional VRAM also is nice. The better upscaler also is nice. So there's all of that. So this is looking pretty good compared against the RX 6600, which has been my go-to recommendation around $200. The last thing I should mention to maybe rain on the parade, or at least maybe not rain on the parade, but you should consider this if you're deciding to buy the B570. Couple of things. Number one, Intel Arc GPUs require ResizeBAR support. If you are on a very old motherboard CPU platform, you need to check that ResizeBAR is supported on your motherboard. You might need to download a BIOS update in order to enable it, and make sure that that's available for you. Do not buy an Intel Arc GPU if you do not have ResizeBAR support. Make sure you check that first. If you're on newer platforms, like you're buying a whole new PC, latest generation parts, shouldn't be an issue. Older parts, that's something you're going to want to check. That brings up one more thing to consider if buying older parts. In testing done by Hardware Unboxed and Hardware Canucks? Is that how you pronounce it? People criticized my last pronunciation of it. I'm not a Canadian, whatever. Anyway, it's been shown that ARC GPUs become CPU bottlenecked at lower frame rates than AMD and Nvidia GPUs. Meaning that while I'm benchmarking on a super high-end CPU here, 9800X3D, to isolate GPU performance as the variable, if you're on a weaker CPU, you could potentially become CPU bottlenecked in situations where you wouldn't if you went with like the RX 6600, for example. That being said, it's generally a lot faster. And I think you are more likely to be GPU bottlenecked than CPU bottlenecked unless you're on an extremely weak old CPU. So I still think that this makes sense. So if you have resizable bar support and are at least on a reasonable CPU platform, I still think the extra 2 gigabytes of VRAM and a lot more performance does mean I'd rather have the B570 than the 6600. Does cost a little bit more, but there's that. That's kind of my conclusion to the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I've also tested it up against the RTX 3050, which was Nvidia's closest price competitor. And it's a bit of a bloodbath because the 6600 is already faster than the 3050. So there's that. But you can take a look at that video for the details, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.